Hello, welcome to the next foundational learning module. I am Matt Dewar, and in this particular module, we're going to focus on why teacher self-awareness matters. So the objectives are to define self-awareness, explain why it matters, identify obstacles to self-awareness, and then finish by identifying some practices for building self-awareness. So what is teacher self-awareness? This is so important because self-awareness is the foundation of all emotional intelligence. And it's composed of two features, and we typically only think of the first feature of self-awareness as being the totality of what it is. And that's internal self-awareness. And so when we break down internal self-awareness, there's really three kind of subcomponents of that. Internal self-awareness is fundamentally knowing what you feel, why you feel it, and how it impacts your ability to relate and perform. Okay? So what does this mean? This means there's a term called interoception. Interoception is the ability to be aware of your physiology. The kind of trademark test for this is if sitting here right now without using your fingers, can you accurately count your heartbeats? Right? So just sitting here, can you actually feel your pulse and know your pulse? And they have tests where they put a pulse oximeter on someone's fingertip, which reads your heart rate and also your oxygen level. And so you'll put the pulse ox on and you'll put it to the side and you'll sit there and you'll try to feel your pulse and accurately estimate what it is and then look at the pulse oximeter to see if it's accurate. This is a baseline reading for how well you can read your own internal state, your own physiology. Interoception, especially awareness of one's heart rate, also corresponds surprisingly with greater social awareness and empathy. That's another discussion for another time, but it's interesting. So it all begins with this ability to feel our heart rate, to notice our breathing, to notice tension in the body, sense of effort or tightness in the musculature. And all of this is giving us clues about the most basic level of arousal in our system, how much stress is being processed in our nervous system. That's interoception. So that's one. And then why do we feel that way? So if I notice that I'm starting to elevate in terms of my internal state, can I pinpoint why that is? Right? Maybe I notice that I'm aborting my exhales. I'm not letting my exhales go. And that my heart rate feels a little bit fast. So there's some tension, some stress in my system. Why? Well, maybe because I didn't sleep well last night. Maybe because my day got off to a bad start and I had an argument at home before I got to work. Maybe because I had a horrible meeting before I went into class and now I'm in the middle of class and I'm being really edgy and I just don't feel at home in my own body. Right? So it's really important to recognize and pick up on these cues that our bodies are giving us all the time, status reports about the state of our system. And then ultimately how it impacts your ability to relate and perform. Most people don't realize that tension in the body drives behavior and decision making. Tension in the body drives behavior and decision making. So if you're completely unaware of the level of stress and tension in your system, you're likely going to be behaving reactively and making reactive decisions on a moment-to-moment basis. The second part is knowing your strengths and weaknesses. And people tend not to be very good at this because it requires a certain level of self-honesty that, frankly, most of us don't quite have. We haven't developed it. And so as a result, we don't necessarily always realize what we're actually good at and what we're not good at. And so it's important to do this. We'll talk about this at the end. Finding a 360 assessment of some kind where other people can assess your strengths and weaknesses and you can see how congruent their assessments are with your own. That's a wonderful way of building that. Then last, knowing your values, purpose, and goals. When I work with teachers, I often ask them to construct their personal philosophy statement. What do you believe to be most valuable, meaningful, and true about yourself specifically, and about other people and life in general? And it's so important to have that personal philosophy articulated, to know what's actually true for you, because that then can help guide the development of your sense of purpose and ultimately your goals. What outcomes do you want to instantiate? Or through what outcomes do you want to instantiate the things that you believe to be most valuable, meaningful, and true? And so all of that together is called internal self-awareness. Now, internal self-awareness has a counterpart, and this counterpart we don't typically think of as being a part of self-awareness, but it is, and it's very important. And that's knowing how other people see you, or seeing yourself as you are seen. Seeing yourself as you are seen. And so often what happens is that people have they think they're self-aware, they think they know themselves, but they have no idea how other people actually perceive them. This is really, really unfortunate. So deep self-awareness is a balance between the internal and external features of self-awareness. So think of self-awareness as a continuum. Now, on one end, you have the internal, and on the other end, you have the external. And if you're stuck too far on either end of the continuum, there's some real liabilities caused by that. But if you're in the middle and you're balanced, you're blending both of that information, that internal sense of self, as well as that ability to perceive how you are being perceived by others. Absolutely vital. Why is it so vital? Because most people, including educators, I would say especially educators, overestimate their self-awareness. We'll get into more of that in a moment, why that is, but we all tend to think we're more self-aware than we actually are, or we tend to think that we have accurate conceptions of how we are, when in fact we don't always. And last, mindfulness is really applied self-awareness. And in the last slide, we'll talk about developing a mindfulness practice, but it's very important to understand that when we're practicing mindfulness, we're ultimately deepening self-awareness. That mindfulness is the very act of self-awareness. So why does self-awareness matter? It matters because it's home base. Self-awareness is home base. If you lack self-awareness, you'll struggle in all the other EI competencies. Let me say that again. If you lack self-awareness, you'll struggle in all the other emotional intelligence competencies. It's very hard to self-regulate if you're not self-aware. It's very hard to be aware of others, have social awareness, if you're not aware of yourself. It's very hard to manage relationships if you are not self-aware, right? And then if you look at Castle's framework, that fifth is decision-making. Well, it's really hard to make good decisions consistently, again, if you lack self-awareness. So it's home base. This is the real skill that we need to invest in, because it creates a momentum that allows us to excel in all the other emotional dimensions of our lives. The ability to understand your own emotions often translates into the ability to understand others' emotions, empathy. There's a condition called alexithymia, and that's the inability to name and experience our own internal emotional states. And what they've found is that people who score high in alexithymia have very low empathy. And people who score low in alexithymia actually score high in empathy. So there's an inverse relationship. So emotional blindness really has a cost. And when it comes to being a teacher and working in a school environment, this is what the research shows repeatedly, not just in schools, but in corporations as well. People do not like to be around or work for others, other people who are low in self-awareness, because these people don't understand how their behavior impacts others. And we've all had bosses who have lacked self-awareness. And it's horrible. It's really hard to work in that type of environment. And imagine what it's like to be a student with a teacher who lacks self-awareness. It's got to be pretty horrible, pretty difficult, right? So there's a real cost as an educator that if we lack self-awareness, we're not helping our students out. And the person of influence establishes the emotional climate and tone. This is one of the key insights of social and emotional intelligence, is that you are the teacher. You teach with who and how you are. And if you lack that self-awareness, you're teaching with that. You're influencing emotionally with that. And if you can't account for that and you're not aware of that, that's going to be a real disadvantage to your instructional acumen, right? You might be inadvertently, unknowingly getting in your own way from an instructional content standpoint. That if your students have to surmount such a large emotional hurdle to exist in your class, to get to your content, that it's just disadvantageous for everyone. So it all comes back to self-awareness. How can we manage our triggers if we don't know what they are? How can we understand our environment without first understanding the lens through which we view it? How can we embrace change if we don't recognize the need for it? And the list of questions pointing back to self-awareness just goes on and on and on. It is foundational for a reason. And so obstacles to self-awareness, human nature, that it's just so much easier to identify other people's flaws, and it's more enjoyable, right, than facing our own shortcomings. It requires a certain level of honesty that can be very unsettling and uncomfortable, which is why we typically try to avoid it. Just easier to embrace a romanticized version of who we want to be or who we think we are. And then outside of that, that's a human tendency that's actually shown cross-culturally, that we just have this bias. There are some cultural norms distinct to our culture that are important to address. And that is, we really think we're all special and unique and superior. And as nice as those sentiments are at times, they're not necessarily always true. And that can really get in the way of our ability to be self-aware. We very much are proponents of self-esteem, and we want to feel good. And sometimes really deeply reflecting on ourselves affronts our self-esteem and affronts feeling good. And we have to be okay with that if we want to grow and become the human beings and educators that we'd ideally like to be. Something called the selfie syndrome, right? Self-preoccupation. We're so preoccupied with ourselves. And this leads into the manufactured social media self-image, where we're so invested in creating this image of ourselves to manufacture to the world that isn't at all necessarily congruent with who and how we actually are. And so all of these things together, culturally speaking, really stand as significant obstacles and hurdles to developing our self-awareness. There's an interesting phenomenon where it's suggested that people are becoming, in some ways, less emotionally intelligent, and yet people more and more are scoring themselves higher and higher in emotional intelligence. Right? It's perfect. And so it shows that the more emotionally intelligent we think we are, the worse our self-awareness is getting. And this has been seen repeatedly, this phenomenon. So self-awareness practices. Commit to a mindfulness practice and develop interoception. Take 5 to 10 minutes a day to be still, to be quiet, to practice attention, to practice paying attention to the fact that you have a body and that your body's having an experience, and that experience isn't neutral, that the information that is fundamental to your experience is communicating things. It's communicating through tension, through relaxation, through openness, through contraction, through shortness of breath, through openness of breath, all sorts of things about our internal state. And when we can tune into that, we can start to realize what we're actually feeling, which means we can start to connect it to why we're feeling that way, the causes, and then ultimately how that becomes our behavior. And so if we can bring that awareness in as a wedge between stimulus and behavior, we can start choosing how we behave based on our values and our personal philosophy, and not based on these kind of innate stress instincts that don't typically lead to the outcomes that we want for ourselves, personally or professionally. So work on expanding your emotion vocabulary. Research shows that the more words we have to describe our inner emotional landscape, the greater our self-awareness is, and the greater our ability to self-regulate, which is huge. Mark Brackett, in his book Permission to Feel, which I'm going to recommend at the end, he talks about the importance of developing a vocabulary for emotions and using it in the presence of children and young adults, because that helps them become more self-aware. Articulate your beliefs and values and clarify your goals. We already talked about that. Develop your personal philosophy. Reduce it to 3 words or less. Hang that somewhere in your car, in your classroom, on your desk, so you can constantly be reminded by your beliefs and your values. Clarify your goals, your passion, your purpose. Identify your strengths and weaknesses, and the best way to do this is ask for 360 feedback. 360 feedback is just take an emotional intelligence assessment or a self-awareness assessment, and then invite 5 to 10 people that you trust and believe have an accurate perception of you, and ask them to take the same assessment regarding yourself, and see how congruent your own self-appraisal is with the way they appraise you. That's really the true marker of self-awareness, is if those 2 worlds intersect. And again, that's that internal and external components of self-awareness. So resources for continued learning, anything written by Daniel Goleman. He's the one who codified emotional intelligence and popularized the term. He's also, I believe, the founder of CASEL. CASEL's work is almost entirely based off of his work. Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. Another great book, Insight by Tasha Eurich, which is all about self-awareness. And then my own workbook that came out in August, the Mindful Breathing Workbook for Teens. Tell you the truth, mostly adults are buying it. And it deals a lot with developing self-awareness, specifically self-awareness through awareness of one's breath. All right, hope this module was useful, and I will see you soon. Take care.